I'm in Sheila, the she shed right now, and thank you for naming her. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I like her. She's real cute. We're starting to decorate a little bit. It's getting more homey.
Yeah.
So
You have to have a name. It adds character to it.
that is true. And I've named my car as well. That's Penelope. So, it fits. Sheila, Penelope. I feel like these are good names. They're all kind of fitting with each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bustos, or I'm sorry, Matt Bustos. I always call you Bustos. But thank you for joining me for another episode on the Makeup Historian. I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning earlier, I pretty much I would just like to see where we go with this particular question. And I really only have one for us to tackle for this episode because we're two history teachers. And most of the time with oral history interviews, we're the ones conducting them. And it's not too often that people are asking, like the historian, the history teachers themselves, like, what do you really think? Or what did you experience as a teacher? So really, I would like us to just kind of tackle what we want to make sure future generations know about what it was really like to be a teacher during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I know this is a loaded question, but I'll let you take the lead. What would you like to start with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that eventually students are going to realize, or at least we're going to tell them that there's very much like this is like a moment of like demarcation where there's teaching before COVID and then there's teaching after COVID. I think kind of in the same way that we as historians look at like seminal moments in American history, right? I just talked with my students about the Kennedy assassination, and there's very much a separation among people that lived through it. Of there's like kind of before the Kennedy assassination and after the Kennedy assassination, and my lights just went out. Okay,
Very
I
good.
have motion sensor lights, and sometimes they just
Also, before we continue on, there is construction going on next door. Can you hear it?
I
Hopefully
cannot
not.
hear it at all.
Good. Then we're in the clear. I just wanted to make sure. Hopefully, I
It's
was
very
like,
well insulated, apparently.
that's the goal. So Sheila is doing her job by giving us good audio for,
There you go.
for the interview. So anyway, my apologies for interrupting. Yeah,
No.
I agree with what you were saying that this is going to be one of those markers in history. Definitely. Yeah. So the tagline of the show is that we're trying to preserve the beauty and blemishes of history. So should we start with the positives or the negatives of being a teacher during all of this first?
I mean, let's start with the positives.
Okay.
I think that a lot of teachers are very set in their ways. You have teachers that have been teaching the same thing for, 15, 20 years, and they're still using the same lesson plans, and they're still like, using a lot of the same resources that they've used, right? And when the pandemic hit, a lot of teachers had to change the way that they did things. So, for example, I never really used Google Classroom or any sort of like online resources. I was very much like rush to the printer before anybody gets there and print out 150 copies and then hand one out to each student. And definitely not the most environmentally friendly way to do things. But I think that using technology, a lot of my colleagues were forced to use technology in a way that they had never used it before. And so, it's great to be able to kind of force people to use these resources that can enhance the way that they teach, enhance the way that they approach their job, because, the students that we have now are so just embedded in technology all the time. And whether we like it or not, they use technology on a daily, hourly basis. And so we have to be able to, I think, look at technology as not just like a hindrance of like, hey, put your phone away, we're in the middle of a lecture, but using technology in a way that helps students understand history.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And it was the same thing with colleges. Like you and I know very well that there's those professors who have been doing the same thing for years. And sometimes that's great, sometimes not so much. But yeah, and in the beginning phases of it, it really forced a lot of our colleagues to re-examine, take a completely different approach. It forced them to get out of their comfort zone. But I, like you were saying, that positive is we we were forced to get caught up with our students in regards to technology. And then I think it's actually a good thing for an educator to not be too rigid, to constantly be like updating things or trying to every 6 months, because digital technology is so integrated into every part of our life now that I mean, this is kind of like maybe the not so pretty side of it, but I think unfortunately, going back to what you were saying of like this being a marker, I think some teachers didn't adjust, and it was like, okay, they didn't want to continue on with it, which is understandable because there was a lot going on. But going back to the positives, those who were, like, no, this is my calling. I love teaching. I'm going to try, like, I'm out of my comfort zone, but I'm going to do my absolute best because my students need me. It's like we're there because we love our students. We love what we teach. And I think I hope future generations remember that there were so many educators, like, without the resources that they really needed, they still got it done because they really care about their students. And I was particularly adamant about really trying to make sure that even if it was online, my students were still getting the same experience, or as close as I possibly could. Like, they're still getting discussions, still talking to people, getting new friends, obtaining the information, things like that. So I agree with you entirely. Yeah. I mean, what are some of the ways that you have changed how you've gone about technology? I know you mentioned Google Classroom, but are there any other new things that you've done in your classes since the pandemic?
Yeah, I've been using online resources a little bit more. So I've had like scavenger hunts where kids. It's been nice. Our district has issued Chromebooks for all of our students, which is a really wonderful thing. Before, we
Nice.
just had every teacher had like a cart of Chromebooks, and there was enough for probably all the students to have one. But once
Mhm.
the pandemic hit, they're just like, okay, we're just going to give every student a Chromebook, so that way they can utilize it. So that's been really convenient, and I'm really thankful that the district did that. So that way, I can have students go on scavenger hunts. I can have them, look up videos. I can have them do research without having to, I remember when I was in high school, we had to schedule time in the computer lab to, go and do research and things like that. And you had maybe 2 days. I'm sure scheduling with all the other teachers was an absolute nightmare. And so the fact that, like first come, first serve kind of deal. So I'm sure it's much nicer to just say, okay, we are studying World War I, so we're going to be, doing research on, different battlefields or different, significant events or things like that. And we can just, the kids can just open up their Chromebooks and they're right there. And so using that mountain of information is really beneficial for these students, because I mean, literally every single piece of knowledge that is in human existence is at their fingertips. And as a teacher, it's important to like recognize that and like, okay, well, we can use that to our advantage.
Definitely. Yeah, and I've talked about this in other interviews before, and before I tackle like the technology thing that you were mentioning, I'm curious what your feedback is on this, or because this is just my own opinion and you and I haven't actually talked about this, but I think that millennials and Gen Z really do hold a very unique place in the context of world history. Like for millennials, for example, there will never be another generation quite like the millennials, because we had this weird phenomenon going on like simultaneously, where we were the last generation to really ever experience growing up in an analog world, but then we were the simultaneously the first to experience growing up in a digital world. So how we go about education, problem solving, politics, culture, all of it, there will never be another generation who truly approaches things like millennials. And then with Gen Z, they're the first to be completely, grow up on digital technologies. So there will be no one quite like them either. And I'm curious what you think about that, because I've said it before, but I haven't had a chance to talk to another historian about it before.
Yeah, I would say that our generation is more adaptable. I would say, we learned, computers when we were, I remember we had our first computer when I was, I think, 12 years old, and our family was just like surrounding it, like, oh my gosh, this is such an amazing thing,
Right.
and it probably is about 1/20th as powerful as my iPhone.
Mhm.
And so, with technology really speeds up society in so many ways. It seems like exponentially, things really develop. And so I think that um, having to deal with that sort of thing in our formative years really allows us to be a little bit more adaptable, right? Whereas,
Definitely.
there's like the cliche of like, teaching your mom how to like use the cell phone and how to like, grandma, this is how you text, and things like that. And,
Yeah,
they, in those aspects, I think the older generation has a little bit of a tough time adapting to that sort of thing. But I think when it comes to us, like, we're just like, hey, next piece of technology, like, great, how does it work, what can we do with it? And we'll be able to figure out different ways to utilize it.
definitely. And something you just mentioned there actually reminded me of like the first like, because I'm teaching at several different colleges, but in the maybe like when we started to realize this was going to be more than 2 weeks, and at Cypress College in particular, we did a faculty training. I think it was like a month into the pandemic or something, to try to help get everyone up to date on different types of software. And I'll never forget it. There was one instructor who said that he was having a really tough time transitioning everything basically overnight to an online format, because he had never taken an online class. And I didn't realize that, because I'm a millennial, and I'm like, that would have to be incredibly difficult. You've never taken an online class. So how would you know how to teach one? How are you going to know those strategies? And you and I, like, I remember having some online classes at Cal State Fullerton. So we just grew up with that. I just was not even thinking about that. So I also think that older generations need a shout out too, like the educators who got it done, even when they had such a challenge with that. Because how would you know? Did anything like that happen in at your school too?
Yeah, some of the teachers that have been around for a while, I remember them sending me, emails saying, hey, how do we do this? How, what do I do with Google Classroom? And I was able to help them out, even though I was brand new. It was my first year at this campus.
Mhm.
Um, but it was really interesting to see, teachers want to teach, and it's like, okay, if this is the new way I have to do it, and this is the new way I have to do it, right? And so,
Yeah.
a lot of them did a really great job, and I commend them for it, because again, like we said, for us, it's much easier to adapt to technology. But for those that are a little bit up there, it's not quite as easy, just because it's something still new to them, right? A lot of them were probably, in their 30s and 40s when they got their first computer. And so, to try and
Yeah.
be able to figure out how a lot of this stuff works, and to be, because when we had technology, it was in our formative years, and our brains, were able to kind of like almost like wrap around technology in a lot of ways, right? Whereas a lot of older folks, still are adjusting, right? But they're, you know, uh, every teacher that I've talked to that has stuck around, um, gave a lot of effort to try and make sure that they did what was best for their students.
Yeah, and I really hope that future generations remember that, just how quickly teachers were forced to completely change the format of their classes, because
Mhm.
we were all told 2 weeks, pretty much on average, everyone was like, okay, we're just going to have to deal with this for 2 weeks. And then it became obvious that it wasn't going away.
It took
And
days to flatten the curve.
yeah. And I even like I vividly remember, and like I wouldn't say I'm super tech savvy, but more than the average professor, and just because of my age. And I was really struggling with that. It's like, okay, we basically have a weekend to get all of our next few lessons in an online format. We have to learn Zoom, try to figure out online teaching dynamics, and then on top of that too, like it was really difficult to get all of our students updated on it. So if you're not familiar with that, it's hard to help all of your students continue on with that as well. Because I had students who didn't have a computer, it was hard for them to get internet access.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and then this is kind of going into one of those blemishes of this whole experience, if you will. Looking back on it, I really think that this was a major uh, mistake on behalf of a lot of schools. I really don't understand why we were not using so much of like tuition to go towards tech resources. I feel like that should have been the first thing that we handled for schools all around the board when it became obvious that we're not going back to being in person. I think we should have really reevaluated budgets and been like, all right, our students need tech. Let's get pristine internet. Let's get them computers. Like you mentioned, going all the way back to what you said about the computer carts. To put things in context, like you're in Arizona and I'm in California. Most California schools didn't get that luxury of we were still really struggling, and that's where politics comes into play too. But yeah, I hope future generations remember that part, that so many teachers still got it done. Even with all of the craziness, like you mentioned earlier, we want to teach and we're there for our students, so we're going to, even the ones where there was a learning curve, they still powered through. I think that's really impressive of them to do that.
Yeah, and we had to, so when we first ended up, going home, going online, we had to change. We had to look at how we're going to like convey information, right? And so I remember I had to, we did sort of like an asynchronous thing where we put stuff on Google Classroom every day for the students, and the students do it, whenever they can. You would hold office hours and things like that, and that's how we sort of ended that school year. And then we had to figure out, okay, now we can't do this for an entire school year. How are we going to look at, um, you know, kind of like integrating, having like still a schedule and things like that to sort of give the students a sense of normalcy.
Definitely. And this is transitioning a little bit, but I'm curious what you think like the long-term implication will be on mental health issues for educators after all of these different experiences, because obviously as teachers we saw the rise in mental health issues with our students, and that's something we talk about a lot on the news, but I feel like the educators themselves are kind of getting lost in that conversation. So like I'll be 100% honest, I really struggled with things regarding mental health throughout this whole pandemic. Like my anxiety went to new levels than it ever had before, and that's saying something. Like I'm in a PhD program. um, this was a lot. So what do you think the impact is going to be, or that we should make sure future generations remember about the mental health impact on teachers?
I think that eventually, I think what's become more acceptable and has kind of changed a little bit in the interim, in the short period, is that no, it's okay to take a day off, right? I think that's a big thing. Is that before, it's like, oh, if you're a teacher, like you're there every day, like there's no taking no days off, right? You have to be there. You have to be there for your students, and I think now it's become more acceptable. Like, hey, if you want me at my best, I need a day off every once in a while, right? I need to take a personal day. I need to take a sick
Hmm.
day. And sometimes like, oh, cough, cough. I need to,
Right.
yeah, there have been times where I've thought to myself, again, like you said, I live in Arizona, and
Mhm.
it's spring training right now, and I just thought to myself, maybe I could take a sick day and head on and and see a spring training. I haven't gotten a chance to do that,
There we go.
and yeah, spring training is almost over, so I don't think I'll be able to. But just sort of recognizing that sometimes you need a day off, and now I'm okay with even with my students. Like I understand we demand a lot from them, and like, hey, listen, like for me as a high school teacher, like you need to take a day off, you need to take a day off, right? And going back to like technology, I have my website that I use for my students. It has literally everything for them. And so if they miss a day, they know exactly what's there.
Yeah.
And so that helps with the students. But I think as far as teachers, I think it has impacted a lot of people, and I think that in a lot of ways, it's thinned the herd in some ways, because there were some teachers that were maybe in it for the wrong reasons, and the second it got tough, they bolted. And
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the teachers that stayed are the ones that have wanted to teach, and this is their life's calling. This is what they want to do. And so
Yeah.
I think that there's been a little shift in understanding, as far as making sure that people know, like, you can take a day off. And like, I haven't openly talked about it with my students, like, I'm probably going to take a mental health day at some point in the next couple weeks. So like, just I'll let you know when, and I'm going to take a day off, and you guys will have work and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for teachers. I think it kind of opened or created the opportunity for teachers to be a lot more transparent with their students about what they were dealing with, and like the power dynamics between teacher and student were kind of went away. And I actually think that is kind of a good thing in regards to mental health issues, and just really getting to know your students and not seeing them just as it's, sometimes with teaching, it gets so overwhelming, all the things we have to do, that we forget to foster those relationships with our students who really need us, and they kind of get lost in the system. So I think those power dynamics kind of being changed was a good thing, and helped the teacher actually figure out a lot more about like, what is my student going through. And if the teacher is open about mental health, then I think it sets a different tone for the students, and they feel like they can talk to you about it too. And that's
Mhm.
one of the, no matter what the subject is, like, I think that's one of the best things about education is developing those relationships, friendships, um, finding mentors. It's like, it's your community. It's such a big part of your life, and teachers play a really big role in that. So I think it was kind of a like a chance for teachers to learn how to truly advocate for themselves, because so much of what we do is about our students. So I think, like you were saying, it was kind of a good chance for us to be like, hey, no, we need some help too. I need a mental health day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, my mental health days are pretty much like, I'm going to go to Target, if I'm being honest, and then maybe a TJ Maxx run and Starbucks. But that's okay.
Well, yeah, and just taking a day like that can really change, your perspective on things, and it can really kind of refresh and rejuvenate and reinvigorate you. I
Mhm.
mean, even when I have a day off, I'm still thinking about my students. Um,
Same.
you know,
Yeah.
so I'll like glance at the clock, like, oh, second period's about to start. Like, I hope everybody's
Mhm.
doing the bell work or whatever. And so you might even have time to re-examine things and change the way you approach something. And I think that that's we grew up with our parents being very like 9 to 5, show up, do what you gotta do, don't complain, that kind of thing. Or at least that's how I grew up. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of changed. And you know for all the grief that we get as millennials, which some of it's deserved, I'll admit that. But there are some instances where like we recognize, like, hey, we need to take a day off every once in a while, and go do whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm actually not too sure about what this is like in Arizona, but in California, I know that healthcare for educators has been a serious issue. Like,
Mhm.
for example, I have not acquired the full-time teaching position, and was right about, like almost there right before the pandemic, and the pandemic ruined that opportunity entirely, and then we went back to hiring a bunch of adjuncts. So the pandemic made it 10 times more difficult to get a full-time teaching position in California. And as a result of that, acquiring benefits, primarily healthcare, has been incredibly difficult to to get. And I think like I would really like people to remember that so many educators did not get healthcare or even help with healthcare throughout the entire pandemic, still to this day. No
Mhm.
help, no nothing. And I know it's super bad in California, but I'm curious what has it been like in Arizona? Are teachers getting more help with that, or is it not so good?
No, I mean, as far as my district is concerned, everything's been fine. They've added extra days off for if you get COVID, and it's for again most of my colleagues are full time. I have maybe I think two or three that are part time, so the dynamics a little bit different for a lot of public schools, about a lot of public high schools, but
Yeah.
everything has been fine. The district has my district has done a good job of adapting and changing things, and being as flexible as they possibly can. So I personally haven't had any issues, and yeah, I know healthcare is such a big issue in this country in general. And so it unfortunately it doesn't surprise me that teachers are the ones that end up getting the short end of the stick in some of these cases.
Yeah, and it's hard because it's like I obviously love what I do more than anything, and I love my home as well. Like I love California, and it's but because of this pandemic, it has really really done a number as an educator. So it's on one hand, I'm super happy to hear that it's not as bad in Arizona, and but then it also is like maybe I need to rethink where I'm at.
Well, yeah, and it's sending a lot of people out here to Arizona.
Yeah. I mean, and my family's out there too. So I remain open minded. I don't know where I'll end up, but I definitely still want to try to bring attention to that and help my fellow educators in California because this is just, I think it's unacceptable to not, and the colleges, I think what they're doing, like this really started back like with the 2008 recession was when it really got amplified where at the college level, instead of hiring the full-time professor, they just started divvying up and, like, let's just give one class to four adjuncts or two adjuncts, two classes, and then that's it. So that way they were always just right there and you were still technically considered part-time. So they didn't have to give you those benefits.
Mhm.
But I think the pandemic really should have changed all of that. And it was like, so you're asking educators to continue on with all of their normal course load. In fact, actually, more so because they're having that technology learning curve. They're having to handle their own mental health, their own physical health, be there for their students, and there's still no help. And if anything, I don't know what again, I don't know what this has been like with your district, but I'll be real. In my districts, all we pretty much got in regards to like healthcare or mental health was a Zoom seminar constantly. Like I lost count of how many emails we had about, oh, we have this mental health Zoom seminar, or there's these different clinics that you can get help with for healthcare. It's like, are you kidding me? How many Zoom seminars can you do? We need healthcare.
Mhm.
We're people, and I'm like, that's just, I feel like this is one of the ultimate blemishes in regards to education about the pandemic. This is not good.
Yeah, yeah, I would concur. I think that when I first started going to grad school, my thought was, oh, I'm going to get a master's degree and I'm going to teach at a junior college, right? Because there'll be plenty of jobs, plenty of opportunities. And then, once 2008 hits, then they chop those jobs up, and then the pandemic hits and they chop those jobs up even more.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it is I definitely sympathize with a lot of you guys because I think as far as the mental health aspect, one of the best things that I've had is my colleagues. I think it's a much tighter community probably than the community college, because I see all of my coworkers in my department every single day.
That
And
must be
so
nice.
yeah, and so we had meetings on Google Meet and things like that, and we just we talked about it, and we were able to kind of communicate and things like that. And so I think knowing that you're not alone going through something like that is really helpful. And so,
Yeah.
a lot of times I feel like, adjunct professors feel like they're on an island sometimes, right? It's, and, it can be a little
Yep.
bit difficult.
Yeah, I definitely kind of got the sense that like there were moments there where it really didn't feel like the department cared at all about what I was going through, if I was even there. And I think a lot of adjuncts would kind of testify to that as well. And on top of that, this is another thing that happens in colleges. I'm just going to be real. Like, I don't know why departments schedule a lot of their meetings at the times when adjuncts are teaching their classes. So it's like I can't make the meeting, and then that continues to fuel that feeling of being alone. And then there's that, like, and it's so competitive at the college level too, that sometimes you get a little bit scared, like, can I talk to another professor, because we're really going for the same job here, like that coveted full-time position. And it just I don't know. The pandemic was not good to colleges. Let's put it that way, or like the faculty at colleges. Unless you were full time, then maybe it was okay. But if you were an adjunct like myself, who got really lost in all of this, it got difficult.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and you and I actually were both substitute teachers for a while, before we ever got our own classes. And I'm curious about what you know about, like, from our own experiences. I honestly cannot, from what I remember about being a substitute teacher, I I can only imagine what it was like during the pandemic. I don't know what your thoughts are up on that.
Yeah, so things change for subs, some for the better, some for the worse, depending on who is willing to stick it out. I have noticed that pay rates for subs have gone up, in the past couple of years because so many people were scared about being in a classroom with students,
Yeah.
and there have been, earlier in the year we had sub shortages, to the point where teachers had to, on their off period, had to go cover a class because their colleague wasn't here, because we just didn't have enough subs that were taking the jobs. And so, on one hand, it's nice because if you were like me, I was in 4 different school districts at the same time when I was subbing, and I was just, I could, I had to like scrimp and scrape, save to try and get a job, in some instances. Whereas I think during the pandemic, it was beneficial for a lot of subs because, their cup runneth over. They could just, like, hey, I can wake up and I got a job right there. I don't have to worry about it. I know, that I'm going to wake up and I'll be able to find something to do and I'll be able to find a gig. So it's been, I'm sure, beneficial for them. But, on as far as that's concerned, but I'm sure the negative of, trying to, manage, especially those that are like immunocompromised and things like that. And, because a lot of our subs in our district, are older and have retired and are doing this for, extra income or maintaining
Yeah.
insurance, things like that. And so, I'm sure it was a really difficult decision for a lot of them to, decide whether or not they wanted to keep subbing. So, it was definitely probably a difficult decision for a lot of them to make.
Yeah, entirely. And there, like, from what I remember about being a substitute teacher, you started to, you know, go into this. One of the best things about it was, and actually one of your selling points to me when you first told me about it was that you can have a lot of control over your schedule. And I would became a sub in it during grad school. So that was a huge blessing to be able to, like, okay, I need a job tomorrow. I can probably find a job. This was before the pandemic, but that was good because it gave you control over your schedule. Or if you needed to cancel because something came up, if there was a internship or something that you wanted to go to, you weren't tied down to it. you also got a lot of teaching experience. You learned all sorts of different things about classroom management really fast. It was like a crash course on it. But then on the same time, at the same time, there isn't a lot of job security there. But the pandemic, like you were saying, yes, because teachers were so burnt out, there was this increase in jobs for substitutes. But it's sometimes I feel like we kind of get substitute teachers by saying like, oh, you have this control over your schedule. And when we forget to tell them, but there isn't exactly like job security here. I don't know if the pandemic has changed that because it's been a few years, it's more than a few years, but since I've been a substitute, but I hope it has. I hope the pandemic has brought more attention to substitute teachers and their needs as well, because I feel like so often they get left out of department discussions, and they get kind of lost in the transition of everything. So
Yeah, it really is a thankless job sometimes, and it definitely sharpened me as far as like being able to be an effective teacher, I think.
mhm.
But yeah, it's definitely it's definitely difficult for a lot of them.
Yeah, and I don't mean to one of the things I learned very quickly, this isn't a dig, this is just like a thing for every teacher to figure out for themselves. The whole experience of being a substitute teacher was I figured out very quickly. K through 12 was not for me. And I was much better, like I had a better temperament for teaching adults. So I will say that though, that for anyone who's thinking about becoming a teacher, a good way to figure out what age group you really work best with is to become a substitute and to test out different classroom management styles. It's such a marketable experience, like for when you're doing interviews. But I hope the pandemic has changed things for the better.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. But do you have any fun teaching stories before I continue on with my questions?
Fun teaching stories. Oh, geez.
I saw the memes you guys created. You have to
Uh,
have good stories.
well, yeah. Oh, I definitely have some memes. I definitely, I don't know if I showed you the Will Smith meme that I made for my students.
I don't think I've seen that one yet.
Oh no! So we were
Oh,
talking about the Cold
no.
War, and so this week on Monday, I opened up class with a meme of Will Smith getting slapped in the face, and it had to do with the Korean War.
Okay.
So
Oh
it, it
gosh.
it was so I love using things like that, and the kids usually sometimes they don't think my memes are funny, but I think they're funny, and that's all that matters really. Um,
Right.
but
I feel like that's every teacher. We're like, I,
no,
I,
yeah, like
I thought it was funny.
no, yeah, like I'm here to make myself laugh. Like if you guys laugh, great, but you know,
All
I'm
right.
here for I have to entertain myself sometimes. Um,
It's true.
as far as like fun teaching stories, um, you know, I will say that during the Cold War, during my Cold War unit, when I study McCarthyism, one of the things that I do is I have like a plant in the audience, like a plant in my classroom, where I tell them that okay, I'm going to accuse you of stealing something, and I'm going to be really aggressive about it, and you're going to play along, and everybody's going to be completely shocked, and we'll get into afterwards. We'll talk about McCarthyism and things like that, and to really
Wow.
kind of experience how people do that. So the first time I did it with a sixth grade classroom, and
Yeah.
I made the mistake of not telling the sixth grader what I was doing.
Oh,
And so I may or may not have made a sixth grader cry while trying to teach them about the Cold War. So
oh my
you know,
gosh, Bustos.
I definitely felt terrible about it.
Oh
But that's
no.
that's why I ask the students ahead of time now. And
That's so funny.
sometimes they give it away, and sometimes I give it away with like a slight chuckle or something. And it very rarely goes the way I plan it, but I'd rather do that than make a student cry. So
You know
I
it wasn't intentional. So
no, it definitely wasn't. But I can be very loud and to just a normal human being, but to a little sixth grader, I'm sure it was definitely probably a traumatic experience.
That's, oh, well, it's a story for the books, unfortunately. Hopefully I know you didn't mean it.
No, I
Yeah.
definitely did not. No, yeah, I felt really bad.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's like this is sometimes the things we don't talk about as teachers, like those little moments like that, but you learn so much from it and how to continue on. But I've always been a big fan of how you integrate like humor into your classroom and your lectures and even in grad school. I remember that. You were very well, our group of friends was little too good at being humorous in
Yeah.
class, but just a little. But still, I think it's such a good thing to incorporate, especially into history classes, because we talk about some really difficult things at times. And I think humor is actually incredibly healing. It can help like people discuss like some things that are really difficult at
Mhm.
times. And even, oh, sorry, I cut you off.
No, 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 no. I was just gonna say, one of my favorite things to talk about is the kitchen debates between Nixon and Khrushchev, and I'm making a lot of Cold War references because I'm talking about the Cold War right now.
That's
But
okay.
like one of my favorite things to do is talk about how the one thing that Khrushchev wanted to do that he couldn't get to do. Do you know what that was?
I feel like I should, but I don't.
He was in. I'll give you a hint. He was in California,
Oh god.
right?
Oh no.
He was in Southern California, and what's something everybody wants to do when they visit Southern California?
Go to the beach?
Go to the beach and Disneyland.
Oh.
Khrushchev
Okay.
wanted to go to Disneyland, but they wouldn't let him because,
What?
like,
I
could you
didn't.
imagine like the Soviet premier walking around Disneyland and in front of like literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people?
Oh my gosh, I didn't know this story.
Hmm.
Goodness.
Yeah, so yeah,
Oh,
the State Department was like, well, no, we're not letting you go to Disneyland because all it takes is like someone like throwing like a soda at Khrushchev, and him getting upset and like causing an entire like international incident.
yeah,
Yeah,
this is like a potential PR nightmare
yeah, well, like it's
on
literally like
steroids.
he could call like the Kremlin the next day and be like, yeah, go ahead and fire up the nukes. They threw a drink at me. Like I'm done. This is it, right? And so I just like I have this image of Khrushchev with like Mickey ears on, and it's just it's anything to like knock him down a peg. He deserves it. Um, but things like that, like those funny little stories that you know we we learn as we like learn about history, like those things that we can tell students that are super fun and kind of like humanize these people and can still like make people chuckle and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it brings it to life, because it's like the structural realities from one generation to the next change, but what doesn't change is human nature and emotions, and that's how we can connect with these previous generations. Like that's why you can read a love letter from 1,000 years ago and you still know the feelings, you still get it because of human nature. So I
Mhm.
love that. I love integrating humor. I feel like though in my classes when I try to integrate it, sometimes it doesn't go well, but like when I'm not even trying, then it's funny. Like it's almost like a joke at my expense. I'm not trying. Like, or like sometimes I feel like I unintentionally set things up and then my students take it a totally different way. And I was like, that's not where I thought we would go with this discussion, but okay, we're still learning. Okay, this is good.
Yeah, those sentences that you sound perfectly fine in your head, and then you say them out loud, and all of a sudden the students start like giggling and like, oh,
Exactly.
yeah.
Even at the college level. Like today we briefly talked about the presidential debates between JFK and Nixon and how they
Oh, I
were
talked about that
televised.
today too.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's really cool. Well, so you'll understand, like, all of and we talked about this in grad school too, like how people who listened to it on the radio perceived it versus if they watched it, how they perceived it. And so I was telling this story to my class, like literally 2 hours ago or something. And one of I pulled up a little clip from it, and one of the girls in the class goes like, "Oh, JFK is really hot." And I was like, it's like, you're not wrong, but that's not where I thought we would go with this. Then I felt kind of bad for Nixon. I was like, well, so that's what I mean. Little things like that come up in class, and it's funny in the moment, but as a teacher, I feel like I have to be in teacher mode. And I'm like, that's not where I thought we would go with this, but
Mhm. Yeah,
okay.
and but you can use that and talk about the fact that yeah, he was a very attractive guy, and that made it a lot easier for him to be on camera, right?
Hmm.
Also, since this is the Makeup Historian podcast, I shared this little tidbit with my students. They had to make a decision as to whether or not they were going to wear makeup, and at
Oh,
the beginning of the debate, because it's the first televised debate,
yeah, that's right.
and they
Yeah.
make an agreement like, okay, yeah, we're not going to wear makeup, yeah, and then Kennedy goes in the back and puts makeup on.
Oh, I actually didn't know that part. I knew the part about Nixon, like how he didn't have any, and that was why unfortunately for him, we didn't know too much about like the stage lights and everything and how that's gonna. I feel bad for him. Like even when we look back on it, we can see the sweat kind of dripping down. I'm like, well,
Mhm.
if we would
Well,
have had some makeup, that might have helped.
yeah, well, so the fact that he had been in the hospital for a few days before that with the flu, um,
Yeah.
and this is something that a lot of people don't know. Kennedy's campaign workers found out what side each of them were going to be on, and they actually went in the rafters and turned the lights up on Nixon's side, like super bright.
No, I did not know that.
So if you go back, I showed kids like the clip today. Like you'll notice he's blinking his eyes a bunch,
Yeah.
because sweat is literally like pouring down his face.
But I didn't know that was a intentional that they really turned him up like all the way.
Because like if you look at Kennedy, like he's fine, like he's got
Cool, calm, collected.
yeah,
Looks
his
good.
face is flush, things like that. But yeah, Nixon just he looks like he's having the worst time of his life up there.
Yeah, well, now it makes sense. Like, I only knew part of that story. Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, I'm glad that you threw that in there, especially given the title of the show. That helps a lot. But and actually, this is why, like, I mean, we were in grad school together, like when I even started all of this cosmetic history research. So you were there for the first, papers that I was trying to make happen and things. I think you edited one of them because we were editors together on the Will of Ethan. I think I bugged you and was like, hey, can you edit one of these or something? I need help. But going back to like the main point I'm trying to make here is that this is one of my favorite things about cosmetic history is that we can use it as this lens to really figure out, like it prompts these bigger discussions about politics, the
Mhm.
economy, all sorts of different things. And we tend to overlook just how funny cosmetic like how funny these conversations can be with cosmetics kind of like at the core of them. So
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great part about history, is that whatever you love, there's a history about it, right? And that's one of the things that drew me to history. Was when I was a kid, I loved baseball. It was one of my favorite things, and you know, getting into the history of baseball is like what got me into history. And
mm,
so it's a really wonderful vehicle. And so whenever I hear students say, "Oh, I don't like history," I say, "Well, what do you like?" And they'll tell me, music or movies or something like that. And say, "Well, guess what? There's a history to it,
yeah.
and you can study it, and you can look at how how things progress." And so that's with cosmetic history, like you were fortunate enough to find something like that, and really kind of make it your own. And that's it's a really wonderful thing that I hope students that are studying history now really realizes that they can there are ways to find a niche. And it's one of those things where like if find what you love and figure out how to make money doing it, you know?
hmm And something too that I think like maybe we should be, especially grad students, that I think we should be telling them is that sometimes, maybe the job you want, it might not exist right now, but be brave enough to go out and try to create it. Like create that niche thing that you want. I think that's one of the beautiful things about the whole grad school experience, and that we really got to, go through at Cal State Fullerton. I I hope more people do that, because sometimes I think when people get into grad school, it's like it's very easy to just go through the motions and get caught up in the stress, which I definitely did at times. But looking back on it, I wish I could have been like, a little bit more like, ah, Sarah, it's okay, go for it. Like even earlier than I did. It took me a while to get there.
Mhm.
Because really, I mean, the makeup historian, it was a nickname in the beginning, and then eventually it was like, well, maybe I can actually research this, and then now it's turned into like I want to try to establish this as a field. That maybe one day books, maybe one day a museum, things like that. So yeah, no, I think that's really good. And actually, the Cal State Fullerton, our department, reached out, and I'll be on one of their alumni boards in a few weeks here,
Oh, fun.
talking about, yeah, and we're, kind of going over things like advice for grad students. And you were just absolutely phenomenal in the grad school experience. So I'm curious if you have any. I remember like your projects and everything, you were great. So do you have any advice for grad students? Because it can get really, especially with history, we read and we write all the time and it gets overwhelming. Do you have any advice for
Uh, so,
history majors?
oh gosh, don't do it. No, okay. Uh, the way, no, it's funny.
Run.
One of my friends asked me to like describe grad school. I said, grad school is like eating a pizza on your own. Like it seems like a really good idea at the beginning of it, and then about halfway through, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I can finish this, and then and then you just power through, just like, okay, just one more slice, just one more, I'll
Oh
get
my
there, I'll get there, I'll get
gosh.
there, right? And so that's how I describe it. You're going to get discouraged, right? It's going to happen. There's no way around it. Like if you're not discouraged, then you're not, challenging yourself. It's just that's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
And so, there are moments when you're going to face issues, and to be able to kind of power through that is important. So just remember, I mean, for me, like the thing that motivated me is I'm paying a lot of money for this. I should really make sure that I finish and get that degree. So
That's yeah.
I'm not just paying student loans just for no reason.
Mhm.
So that was one thing that motivated me. But I would say talking with friends and talking with colleagues, and making it an experience, right? Something that you go through together, right? And really try and make friends with the people that you're going to school with, because there's everybody is like a duck on the pond. Like we're all like, oh yeah, I'm totally handling all this reading, and it's totally fine, and I got this, right? And then you get home and you're just like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to finish an entire book this week? And
Mhm.
I have work, and I have other things that I have to do, and you're frantically trying to finish everything. And so I think the best thing to remember is that other people are struggling with you,
Yeah,
and the struggle together makes it better, makes it tolerable. I think that's the important thing.
definitely. And we had such an amazing group at Cal State Fullerton, which I think was such a good blessing. Yeah, like if you can find that community, find a group of friends that, you're all going through it, that's great. Still friends to this day. Like I will always cherish those friendships from grad school, because and it continues on. Like those experiences and things that you went through, it's going to help you when you become an educator, or no matter where you go, however you market that degree. If you have that community, you always go back to it. And on top of that, like I would say probably the thing I was really bad at in grad school was I what got prideful. I didn't want to say that I need help, or I don't understand this. And it wasn't until about halfway through the experience that I was finally like, okay, I gotta ask for help. And then that was when the entire game changed. So I would say to anyone at, whether it's grad school, your bachelor's, just in college, um, don't be afraid to ask for help. Like, do it sooner rather than later. Cause like you said, everyone's going through it. Everyone's got something that they're dealing with. Um, so I know I've kept you here for a while. I've taken quite a bit of your time, but do you have any final things that you really want to make sure, we that go on record for when people 50, 100 years from now stumble across this one interview?
Oh man.
They're like, what was it like for teachers?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, when I teach this unit in like 20 years, I'm just skipping it. Like, nope, nothing happened from 2019 to 2022. Like,
We don't
we
need
all
to
just
talk
stayed
about that.
inside and we all bought toilet paper and it was fine. Like, that was it. That's all we did.
Yeah.
But no, I think, I think the one thing that, people should take away from, having to go through, teaching during the pandemic is that it really altered students in a way, right? In a very profound way. Like there's a big difference between students from 2019 and before to students after, right? And I think that one of the things that teachers, again, we talked about kind of at the beginning, is that teachers sometimes can be a little set in their ways, and kind of want the students to adapt to them.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to remember as teachers that we need to be the ones to adapt to our students, right? So, like for example, I before the pandemic, like no cell phones in my class at all. Like from the time the bell rings to the time we leave, I don't want to see a cell phone, right? Now it's, hey, first little bit, like let's not have a phone out, but afterwards, like if you're working, like yeah, fine, take a phone out, right? That's fine, right? And so I think that that has changed students, and so we have to, rather than just like, hey, this is the hill I'm going to die on, right? You have to be able to adjust, right? And so I think, again, the thing that people need to remember about teaching during the pandemic is, we had to adjust to our students, right? And I'm sure students are going to continue to adjust and change, right? And it'll be interesting to see how that like learning loss that took place, which is a very real thing,
Yeah.
how that learning loss is going to impact generations, from for the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah, definitely. I hope that especially future history students, when they are going through their research process, tackling their papers, whatever it is, their projects, that they will not, that they'll go beyond mainstream media sources. Because if we only listen to mainstream media, especially the sources that are being produced right now, um, I think the perception, or like we're not getting the message that there are more teachers who got it done than those who complained. Like the majority of teachers were like, no, this is about my students. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to help them. If admin's not helping me, all right. But this is, I'm going to figure out a way. And more like the majority of educators, we powered through. And that's why I'm like, I hope, don't get to future history students, don't get lost in the mainstream media sources when you're, 50 years from now, when you're looking back on this, because there's so much more to it. Like really focus on those everyday realities and try to find other interviews like this one with other teachers who are like, hey, this is, our voice is important too. And this is a turning point in the history of education in America, and well, worldwide too. And hopefully this interview helps, scholars in the future.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Bustos, for taking time to speak with me here on the Makeup Historian. I really appreciate it. And you're always welcome here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.